Welcome to the Hill Update. I'm your host, Dean Allison, Member of Parliament for Niagara West. Well, Parliament is finally back this week. It's been 5 months since MPs sat in the House of Commons, and a lot has happened since then. We've had an election where the Liberals returned with another minority, an election that many critics called needless, particularly because it took place at the height of the fourth wave of the pandemic and produced virtually the same results. There are many important issues parliamentarians would need to deal with in the coming weeks and perhaps years, most important of which seems to be the rising inflation rate and the cost of living crisis. There wasn't much attention given to these topics in the speech from the throne, delivered this week by the Governor General on behalf of the government. The speech was generally a rehash of government electoral promises. There were over half a dozen references to climate change and reconciliation, while topics like inflation and the supply chain only received one mention each. Macdonald Laurier Institute's Domestic Policy Director, Aaron Woodnick, criticized the speech as lacking any serious thought about inflation. He said, "It is understandable that the government is focused on the pandemic, but beyond that, much of this throne speech comes across as incredibly disconnected from day-to-day struggles many Canadians are facing." He went on to say that it was very odd to hear that the speech referenced inflation as a major concern and then proceed to completely ignore it, while bizarrely pointing out to the housing and childcare as addressing the actual inflation. Canada's inflation rate is at its highest point since 2003. With the cost of living up 4.7% compared to a year ago, this is far above the Bank of Canada's 2% target, and analysts predict it will rise even further. Groceries, gas, home heating, and many other essentials have increased in price, some items as much as 20%. We're dealing with record prices for milk. Butter and juice are up more than 5%. Eggs are up more than 7%. Pork up over 9.5%. And of course, we've seen what has happened to prices at the gas pump. Housing prices have also seemed to be out of control and reaching new year-over-year records. This is all on top of a global supply chain crisis and a severe labor shortage, which are causing even more upward pressure on prices. Critics are pointing to the fact that the government spent $400 billion above normal levels over the last 2 years, with a deficit among the highest in the G20 last year alone. The Conservatives have accused the government of running an ideological agenda not focused on the needs of Canada. Aaron O'Toole, the leader of the Conservatives, said that family budgets are being stretched thin and that more and more Canadian families are relying on food banks. He also added that the government is not paying attention to the real issues like inflation and is not taking steps to improve the economy. Another major development on Parliament Hill is the government's proposed return to a hybrid format as a way to conduct the House of Commons proceedings. The Liberals and the NDP have supported this move. They argue that the hybrid sittings will help prevent the spread of COVID-19 and allow MPs who are ill or have sick family members the ability to participate from their homes or their offices. The Conservatives and the Bloc, on the other hand, want a return to normal in-person sittings. Conservatives Deputy Leader Candace Bergen argued that the hybrid format is designed to protect the government from scrutiny and accountability, not to protect Canadians from the deadly virus, and that the government has been left off the hook because they haven't been there. MP Bergen went further and said that the government's enthusiasm for virtual proceedings doesn't have anything to do with protecting themselves or anyone else from COVID. They are protecting themselves from accountability and scrutiny. We've seen that, and we believe that this is time that we stopped it. Aaron O'Toole also commented saying millions of Canadians don't have the option to participate in a hybrid workplace. The Liberals and the NDP are asking for special treatment and accommodation that average Canadians themselves don't have access to. I myself have taken part in a few sessions where the Speaker of the House proceeded in the daily order of business without a single MP, minister in the House. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh has said MPs should consider adopting the hybrid format permanently because it would allow MPs with young children to take part in debates from home, and that this format would be more becoming an MP and make it attractive for people with caring responsibilities. This debate is taking place following Quebec MP Richard Lehoux's positive COVID-19 test last weekend. MP Lehoux, who is fully vaccinated, is currently at home after being diagnosed with COVID-19 on Saturday, 2 days after attending an in-caucus meeting. When we come back from break, we're going to meet with former MP Harold Albrecht, who is the Member of Parliament at Kitchener-Conestoga for over 13 years, when we come back from break. Welcome back to the Hill Update. Joining me on the show this week is Harold Albrecht, who was the Member of Parliament for Kitchener-Conestoga for over 13 years. Harold, welcome to the show. Thank you for taking time to join me. You know, the first week back, and I know you've been through a number of these, I think it's important we explain to the listeners sort of the process of the week and what happens. I mean, after new Parliament, what goes on? I think the first part we want to talk about is the election of the Speaker. Any thoughts on that and that process and how that works?
Well, it's been a couple of years since I've been there, Dean, but I can remember it clearly, the election of the Speaker, the many rounds of elections. So you finally get to your Speaker who has the majority of the votes of the members of Parliament. And I must say I was pleased to see Anthony Rota re-elected. I always found Anthony a very approachable MP, very fair in his rulings. Even though I haven't sat under his rulings, I've watched from the sidelines, and I believe that he's a good choice for the Speaker.
You know, it's interesting. We did change the format up on you a bit, Harold. We went with a preferential ballot. So, the hours we would go back and forth on, there were 7 people on the ballot this time. Okay. And so obviously it takes a while to drop those off. And, I think a good indication to me with Anthony being reelected was that people were happy with the job. And I think you mentioned it, from what you could see from the outside there, he certainly looked like the jobs he's done in the last 18 months were pretty fair.
Right, and his big asset is he's fluently bilingual, and so he knows both languages well and knows the culture of both communities very well.
So once we get ourselves a Speaker, which is always on the Monday, it is processed to make sure that we have a speech from the throne. So, what exactly is a speech from the throne, and why does this happen, Harold?
Well, in my understanding, the speech from the throne in broad strokes lays out the government's priorities for the coming session. And while I listened to the entire speech, I watched the entire speech, took notes while Governor General was speaking. I must say I was disappointed with the big picture. There were a few bright spots within the speech from the throne that I think we should acknowledge and celebrate. But for the most part, it was a rehash, in my opinion, of many of the supposed goals that the Liberals have had, in some cases, since the late 90s. And they're finally getting around to it. At least they say they're getting around to it. We'll see.
Oh yeah, no. And so when we will go through the first week, it is a unique week, right? Because you have the election of the Speaker, you have the speech from the throne, and then you have parties respond to that. So there's really not a whole lot of business that, obviously, other than laying out the broad strokes, and we'll talk about that in the next segment. After the speech from the throne this week, however, something that was uniquely different than last time, for obvious reasons, is that we spent a day or so debating a hybrid parliament. Now, we could talk more in detail about that later, but it is interesting to see that one of the things, and there's, I alluded to in my opening remarks, that a hybrid parliament is an interesting concept in that some like it and some don't. What are your thoughts on what you've seen?
Well, I can't speak from a personal experience perspective, but again, watching from the sidelines, I would say that the hybrid parliament has led to a lack of accountability on the part of many MPs. Different times, I would sit up in the gallery and watch question periods. Since I have not been elected, I had the opportunity to sit and watch from the sidelines, and to see the number of Conservative MPs in the House taking their job seriously, in contrast to the number of other MPs, was quite striking. So I'm very confident that an in-person setting of the Parliament is a far better way of hearing your MP speak and of holding them to account for what they're saying.
And we'll speak a little bit more in the next segment on that as well. The other thing that came up this week was we had the Prime Minister head down to Washington for the Three Amigos Summit, right? The summit that they have each year with the President of Mexico, as well as the President of the U.S. And after coming back, we find now that we've got our tariffs are doubled in softwood lumber. I don't know if you've been following it very closely, but obviously that's been a contentious issue that we've had for a number of years, dealing with softwood tariffs as it goes back and forth. We got about 50 seconds left. Just some of your thoughts on tariffs and softwood.
Yeah, well, I think most Canadians are very disappointed with the outcome of that summit. on a number of scores. And the one that you highlighted is probably the biggest one, the softwood lumber tariffs, but also the potato industry and the PEI and across Canada, the agricultural sector. And just to think that President Biden didn't appear for an on-camera summary of the summit, to me says a lot about the cooperation that we can expect between these two leaders. And I'm very disappointed with where that's gone.
Well, listen, Harold, what we're going to do, we're going to wrap up this segment because we've got to go to break. When we come back, let's talk a bit more about the hybrid parliament, just sort of how it works and some of the advantages and disadvantages of that when we come back from break. Welcome back to the Hill Update. I'm talking with former MP Harold Albrecht, who was the MP from Kitchener-Conestoga from 2006 to 2019. Harold, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Great to be with you, Dean.
So what we were talking about before break, just the first week, and I think it's important for people don't always understand what's going on in Ottawa. So if we can explain what's happening, that's part of what we're trying to do here. So we just talked about the process of the week. We talked about electing a speaker. You need that before you can go. Then we talked about a throne speech, and then we've got some other legislation. I want to break down a little bit more the hybrid parliament. And once again, I realize that you didn't actually sit in a hybrid parliament because it happened in the last parliament. But let's just talk about the advantages and disadvantages. I mean, the Liberals raised some points that, it is more flexible for people that maybe have issues or their health, et cetera. Let's explore that for a second and maybe talk about some of the pros and cons of that.
Well, I think there's no question that for someone who is sick and maybe well enough to be on camera, it would be an advantage. It would be an advantage for voting when you're trying to get home for an event in your riding. But the big disadvantage, Dean, for me is that it lacks the interpersonal connection. As a member of parliament, I learned so much from rubbing shoulders with my colleagues in the opposition lobby or in the government lobby when we were in government, and even in interaction across the aisle with members of parliament from the other parties. That personal interaction is far more likely to happen if you're present than taking the initiative to set up a Zoom call or a FaceTime call with one of your colleagues. And the interaction between MPs, as was true in my former profession in dentistry, when you get to a convention, it's great to hear the speakers from the front, from the podium, but you often learn as much or more from your colleagues in informal dialogue. So I think that's one of the big pieces that's missing with the hybrid parliament. The opportunity to connect with the MP themselves and many times with their family. We talk about the importance of family and how important it is for MPs to feel supported in their role. That's a big part of what it means to be a member of parliament for me.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things the Bloc and the Conservatives have said is that, we could put, 45, 50,000 in for a Blue Jays ball game.
Yeah, exactly.
We could put 20,000 people in for a hockey game or a basketball game. Why can we not put in 338 members of parliament? And, there's obviously a lot of other people have gone back to work. And I think one of the arguments was the fact that not everyone's got an option to be at home for Zoom.
Yeah, well, I don't believe for a minute that it has anything to do with the safety of the MP. If, as you pointed out, there's all kinds of large venues that are hosting hundreds and hundreds of people sitting close together, and they're believing that they're safe, obviously continuing to follow protocols. But the aspect of safety, I don't think was really on the top of mind of the members of parliament who voted for that bill last night. I think it was more one of convenience for them.
Well, no, for sure. And I guess you're right. If, there's a number of times during the last parliament where ministers literally were in their offices across the street and wouldn't make it over, even when there wasn't a lot of people in the House. And I think, that's part of that accountability piece that you refer to.
Exactly. I think that's uppermost in my mind, that when you have a member of parliament asking a minister a question across the floor or at a committee, I think the committee is probably the biggest loser here in terms of in-person meetings. Sitting around a committee table, listening to witnesses in person, observing the body language of the presenter and the other MPs, and then getting that informal dialogue across the table. Those are so important in arriving at a good solution, in my opinion.
That's great. Listen, we got about just over a minute left. I want to just start talking. They did introduce some legislation, C2, which was the government was to help create jobs and implement targeted COVID-19 support. So looking at that piece, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it, but let's maybe start talking about it. We can finish talking about it after break. Any thoughts on that legislation?
Yeah, I'm certainly no expert on it, Dean, by any stretch of the imagination. But my concern is, are there mechanisms in place to be sure that those who really need that support are getting it, and that there's not a misuse of the funds that are being appropriated for that purpose? That's always my concern. I believe we needed to support businesses who were struggling. I know of many who have struggled, and some of them who have gone out of business. But it's always important that we have mechanisms in place that we can assure the Canadian taxpayer that their money is being used responsibly.
Yeah, and like I said, I think it's one of the things that the Liberals promised during the campaign was to continue to help those industries that were affected most, such as tourism and hospitality. I think sometimes I'm concerned about is that maybe the threshold is too high for some of them to actually receive some of the support. Listen, after the break, let's talk a bit more about the throne speech when we come back. Welcome back to the Hill Update, and I've got joining me on the show this week, Harold Albrecht, former member of Parliament for the riding of Kitchener-Conestoga. Harold, so we were talking before the break about some of the legislation they've introduced, but let's just back up. I mean, the whole purpose of this first week is really to set the broad strokes of what's going on, what the government would like to accomplish over the coming weeks and months and years, at least in the short term. So let's talk a bit about the speech from the throne and just any initial thoughts. I know I've talked about, it seemed a lot like a rehash of the election, which of course you would expect it to be, right? Because this is, what they ran on. But just any thoughts that you have on the speech from the throne.
Well, again, I would say that not only was it a rehash of the election, it was a rehash of many former of their throne speeches. But I must say, I want to be balanced in my approach here. There were some good things in the throne speech that I was glad to hear. Their commitment to continuing to improve the conditions for our Indigenous peoples with the ending the boil water advisories. That's a great commitment, and I hope and pray that they can do a good job of advancing that agenda. Issues of mental health. These have been issues that I have worked on in all my years in Parliament. Mental health, suicide prevention. And you and I both know, Dean, that the COVID situation has increased our mental health challenges across Canada. Many people facing mental health challenges because of the restrictions, the lockdowns, the fear of COVID. All of these need to be addressed. There were two things that I was specifically interested to see. Was there on the climate change file? I heard for the first time, it may have been said earlier, but I heard for the first time that they're committed to Canada's first ever national adaptation strategy. And I think that's significant because we can argue until the cows come home. What is the cause of climate change? Is it man-made? Is it natural cycles? All of those things, percentages, all of that. At the end of the day, we have to be prepared for adaptation to what's happening. And I think the recent flooding in BC and other tragedies have highlighted that fact. We need to adapt and be better prepared with infrastructure improvements on the ground. So those were some things that I was very happy to see. I was very disappointed as a member of Parliament who represented an urban-rural riding to see that agriculture was basically ignored in the entire throne speech. Agriculture employs 1 in 8 Canadians. It's incredibly important for our economy, but not only for our economy, for our food security. The quality of food that Canadian farmers are producing is second to none, and we've got to support them. We can't continue to put obstacles in their way to make it harder and harder for them to do that. The carbon tax is one of the factors that's doing that. Now, you could say, well, the carbon tax, farmers' fuel that they buy on farm is exempt, but that does not acknowledge the increased costs of fertilizer that are coming to the farm, being trucked to the farm, the produce that is being trucked away from the farm, the feed that's being trucked to the farm. All of these costs are adding to the cost of the farmer doing business, and in the end, adds to the price of food on our table. And if anybody that's been shopping for groceries in the last year has not noticed the increase in food costs.
Well,
They have an unlimited budget.
And then, to that point, though, not other countries that we import food from have to have those costs, correct? That's a
Right.
very obvious statement. They don't have the same cost for their inputs that we do here.
It's a very unfair, it puts our farmers at a very unfair disadvantage in terms of competing on the world economy, in the world economy. Absolutely.
Okay, so I got about a minute left. Let's, the Conservatives talk about inflation. Wasn't mentioned much. Is that a fair concern based on what we're seeing?
Oh, absolutely. To see inflation mentioned, but again, to not take any responsibility for it. Now, I'm not arguing that there isn't a global demand and that has caused inflation as well. But the printing of the money, the increased cost, money that's been available to Canadians, and now the demand for product and the supply chain issues is having a huge impact. And my bigger concern, Dean, is right now interest rates are quite low. And our government can borrow money at a fairly insignificant cost. It's still significant. We're spending over $20 billion a year just on interest. But if the interest rates rise from, say, 2 to 3 to 4%, it's not just a 1 or 2, 3% increase. It's a 10 to 20 to 30 to 40% increase, adding billions of dollars to our debt as a national debt payment. Plus, it's adding many dollars to the local to my own budget in terms of carrying my costs.
I'm sorry I got to cut you off. That's all the time we have, but thank you very much for joining us on the show this week. Thanks for joining us on the Hill Update as we talk about the first week back and the speech from the throne. Have a great week.